Welcome to the Insider by DFIN. I'm Dana Barrett, and joining me today is Frank Kelley. He is the Director of ESG for DFIN. Frank, good to have you.
Thank you.
Always good to talk to you, and I know today we want to get into some of the ESG disclosure rules, but before we do all that, for people who don't know you and your role at DFIN, can you just sort of talk about what you do for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Director and Head of ESG here at DFIN, and so I work with all different stages of companies in their ESG journey. So I work with everything from nascent stage or infancy companies up through very mature companies across industries. And we help them produce data-driven ESG reporting. And in addition, we also work with the companies to produce ancillary reporting services such as website policies, proxies, 10Ks, and you name it.
So anything that crosses into ESG, essentially.
Yeah, soup to nuts.
Soup to nuts. Even aside from the regulations and the mandates, collecting this data and reporting on it is still important just from a stakeholder perspective.
Right now, a lot of companies have kind of a bit of heartburn around, okay, well, what do we do? The good news is that most companies are already starting to report in line with data-driven frameworks. So most issuers, what we're still recommending is that they work with a consultant to produce data-driven ESG reporting, notably in line with the big three frameworks, as we mentioned, SASB, TCFD, and for some leading companies, GRI. Now, GRI does have a lot of rigor in the framework, and so it's not necessarily right, apt, or appropriate for every company, especially nascent stage companies, but companies can build on the foundation of SASB, TCFD, and GRI, continue to produce more impactful reporting that will ultimately be synergistic in EU, with the SEC and the broader global ESG market.
So let's just dig in a little bit more to kind of the demand from these various stakeholder groups. Investors, we know, are already starting to ask for this. Is it something where they're just sort of not making an investment because there's not enough ESG data and reporting, or they don't feel like the standards that they want are being met? Is that what you're seeing in the investor community?
Yeah, ultimately this is still investor driven because investors will ultimately want to see ESG reporting. And specifically ESG reporting that's in line with the major frameworks, so they can compare companies across their industries or their portfolios to assess their sustainability reporting as well as potential risks due to potential ESG and other material topics.
Do you feel like some of the demand, if you will, to make these changes is also coming from customers, from potential employees? Are you seeing any of that in the landscape?
Yeah, it's a true stakeholder universe. But a lot of employees read these ESG reports, future employees. Increasingly, credit rating agencies are paying attention to ESG. I hate to say it, a lot of activists really eye the ESG story. Increasingly, what we found is a lot of the low-hanging fruit corporate governance issues have been plucked, i.e. mitigated over the years. A lot of activists are kind of turning their attention, whether for altruistic reasons or not, toward ESG reporting to say, okay, do they increasingly companies say ESG is strategic and financial? Well, do you have reports around ESG? Do you have reports that are aligned with the data-driven frameworks? Is there rigor to these metrics? And ultimately, are you able to produce it in a palatable format that stakeholders can understand?
Yeah. Usually at least for me, when I think of reporting, I'm thinking of companies just sort of telling the story of what they're already doing. But because a lot of the things under ESG are sort of new for some companies, is the reporting requirement actually changing the way companies are doing business?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of are the new reporting requirements changing the way companies do business? Yes and no. In one hand, companies or issuers ultimately realize they do have to report on ESG, and that requires obviously increasingly a team, potential internal controls around ESG, budgets. But ultimately, most companies, in a way, have always been telling their ESG story, right? Every company has employees, and every company has an emission profile. And how they manage those employees and manage their emission profile has always been part of broader corporate governance, but the broader stakeholder market is really demanding more granularity in ESG reporting around those topics.
So it may not really be about changing the way they do business, but maybe capturing data slightly differently, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And most companies going forward will have to, there will be a true paradigm shift in terms of how they capture data. Historically, most companies did what I called sort of the bailing wire and bubblegum approach, right? They had spreadsheets with all this ESG data. They had sort of maybe Word documents. There was very little internal controls around most ESG data historically. The accounting firms and the assurance firms are saying, well, you have to pass auditability standards. You have to pass accounting standards. And so what most companies are finding is that they really need to start implementing internal controls and financial controls and SaaS solutions around their ESG data so they can report on it, not just successfully in terms of the ultimate deliverable, but so when an auditor comes in and says, where do these ESG topics sit on your board? Where do they sit in your committee? How are you gathering them? Are they firm-wide? Are they just at the headquarters? You can ultimately answer that with an assurance and confidence so it passes muster with auditability.
Well, I heard you say paradigm shift, and when I hear paradigm shift, I think daunting and expensive. Is that what customers are looking at?
No, certainly not. I mean, most companies can utilize one of numerous SaaS solutions and their consultants to start to gather this data, herd those cats, and put them in a central repository to ultimately report on sustainability.
Well, let's talk about how DFIN is working with companies to help produce this sustainability reporting.
Yeah, so DFIN works with, as I mentioned, a kind of wealth and myriad of companies across industries, and it really depends where they are in their journey. The first thing any company has to do is they must have a stake in the ground report. So ultimately, DFIN will work with nascent or infancy stage companies to say, okay, let's take a step back. In terms of how investors and stakeholders look at you, they really look at three vehicles. They look at their website. You're going to go to your website and say, okay, is there ESG reporting? Are there formal policies on it? Another vehicle, kind of the trident, is a regulatory document disclosure. So that would be a proxy or 10K. It really parses out oversight where it sits on the board, committees, are there subject matter experts? And the most important kind of spear of that trident would be an ESG report. And so DFIN will work with companies to say, okay, let's look at your material topics, determine what are the right maybe 7 to 10, 10 to 15 material topics to report on, looking at gaps of those topics and saying, okay, ultimately, how can we help you address those gaps in the short term or intermediate term for your reporting? Determine thematically, how can we frame your ESG program on your website, in your reports, in your proxy, so there's uniformity, and then ultimately drafting and providing the data for the reporting. So that's kind of that nascent stage company. For a more mature company who we've already produced ESG reporting, we're going to want to work with them to say, okay, ultimately we have a list of material topics we're reporting on. We have numerous gaps that we know of. And let's work with you to A, address those gaps, but B, ultimately to start to put some of this data and materiality into proper internal controls, i.e. maybe a SaaS solution, so we're starting to pass auditability standards.
So it's when you all are working with companies to help them through this, it's the consulting side, but also active disclosure, it's some of the product side as well, yes?
Yeah, ultimately what we want to do is take that sort of initial stake in the ground reporting, put it in a dynamic reporting tool like active disclosure, and work with the client so they can set up internal controls so they can draft their ESG reports. So ultimately they can have placeholders and designs that elucidate their great ESG program, and then have data in the report that subsequently can be dynamically updated in a secure repository like AD.
Frank, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been The Insider by DFIN. We'll see you next time.